Hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had some issue with our streaming tool with our Facebook connection. Anyway, we're back now. Today, we're going to be looking at our React expense app, and we'll be doing a complete demo on how to build that application. Jasab, you want to add anything?
No, it's your baby.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So I've already created a base application and I've got my React basic starter application here, and I've also deployed it to Surge. We've done this in previous classes, so I'm not doing that again, so we can save some time. So now let me also just make sure that it's actually working. So my React app is deployed here. Here it is. So you can see that it's.
Adil,
yes.
It's not the video is not going to the PIIC main also.
The Facebook video.
Yeah. Yes.
Let me see. Yeah, it's there. I'll share it to. We're sharing this to the 4IR group, right? I've shared it in the 4IR group now.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so now we have our basic application up and ready, and we can see it on Surge. So now we can get started without having to do all the basic things. So it saves us some time here. And I've got my application here in my GitHub. So you can see my initial commit and deployment. So if you look at the application, I have a basic React application here. So everything is here in my app.js. So what I want to do firstly, just to see what we're trying to build, have another. I did it previously with this. So this is the final output we want. So it's a expense tracking application, and we can look at it here. So first, the most important thing is our form that we can use to submit transactions. So we need to have a description and a dollar amount of the value of that transaction. And what we'd want it to do, so if we say that we have an income one, and we say we earned $1,000, and when we add transaction, it should show in my transaction history, and it should also update my income here, and it should also update my balance. So if we continue and I add another income too of maybe $500, then it should add that income in my transaction history with the description and the amount. It should update my overall income. So it should sum up all my incoming, and then it should also update my balance. And then the other thing is, if I have an expense, so maybe I have to pay bill one, and that's a $100 bill, then I have to, if I add, it would be a minus because it's a negative transaction. We're spending $100. So if I add this, we'll have a $100 expense, which will be shown in my expense amount. And then my current balance would also show this, which would be basically an income minus expense. The other thing is we need to be able to remove a transaction from the history by clicking on a delete button. So maybe I can get rid of someone, and then my balance and my expense and income should stay up to date. So this is what we're trying to build. And I'll leave from here now, and I'll just go back to this basic. Actually, maybe I should just leave it open so we have a reference of what we're trying to build, right? So if we look at, in terms of the user interface, we have a few different components here. And in React, we built components. So if you look at it just by this, we have a header component, which has the title of our application. Then we have a component that shows the balance. We have a component that shows the income and expense summary. We have a component that contains all the transaction history, so all the transactions we've added. And then we have a component with the form. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 components that we need to build into this application. So if we start here, what we can do is we can start working with the UI. So here we can let's just get rid of this. We'll basically have our, let me also start this in my local server, so I can do yarn start, so I can see all of my work as I'm changing code. Still starting. So I have my basic application up, and I just have a hello world text. So in my environment here, I have my local environment here. I have my search deployment here, and I have my target, what I want to build here. Okay. So let's start by building out each component. So to build the components, what I'll do is in my source folder, I want to keep the component code separate from the rest of this. We can have a folder for components. And in this, I'll add my files, my JavaScript files, to have all of these different components. So I'll create header.js, which will have my header component. Then I also have my balance component. So I'll create another file for balance. And I have my account summary. So I'll call this account summary. I have another component for transaction history and add transaction. So I have transaction history, and I can have a add transaction. So I have created the different JavaScript files for each of my components. Let's just start with the header component first. And what we can do is use this React functional component extension. So I've got my basic structure for my header here. So I'm importing from React, and I'm exporting the header arrow function here. So now what we want to do is, in this I'll just give this a title, and I'll go with, instead of div in my code, I used h1 for this, and here I can have the title of my application. So I'll do, what did I name it? I named it expense tracker. Okay, so that's my header component, and what I need to do is I need to show it in my app.js. So to do this, I have to come to my app.js file, and I have to import my header. So I can do import components, and I'll import my header from components. All my components are in my components folder, and then it's header.js. So now I have my header component imported. What I can do is get rid of this hello world, and I can call my header component here. So it should now update my local host, and I have my first header component created. Next, we can move along and do the, one thing I can do is, in my app.css, I have this, this is the CSS for the basic React application. What I want to do is have my CSS. We're not really teaching CSS here, so what I'll do is in my other project, I have a CSS file here, so I'll just use this one. Just get the code from here and paste this CSS here in my application, and now I should have my CSS applied to my whole application. So there we go. So that's our header component has been created. Next, we'll do the balance component. So,
Adil, can you please increase the size of text editor?
Sure. Okay, this. Is it better?
Yeah. That will be difficult for you. This is okay.
So that was my header. Now I want to do my balance component. So again, what I'll do is I'll create a React functional component here called balance, and in this one I need to have my my code for the balance. So here it's a simple 2-line code. So in my CSS it's h4, and this will say the current balance. So to show the current balance of my whole account right now, and here we'll have we want to show the balance of this whole thing. So right now we're just gonna put a placeholder here, and we'll call this a. Give this a. I think that's all we need. So that's my balance, and then I can go back to my app.js, and I want to add my balance component here. So again, I'll import balance from components/balance, because balance component is in my components folder. And then here, what I'll do is I want to add my balance component. So one thing that we did in this whole thing is the title is separate, and all of these are in one big container. So I'll just I'll create a div here, and I'll give this a class name of container. So we created a container here, and here I just want to add my balance component. So my full application should show my current balance. Okay, so done this. Next, we want to add our next component, which is the account summary component. So this one. So in the account summary component, we'll go to our account summary JavaScript. And we can create our functional component. And in our account summary, we have to, I'm coding the class names according to the CSS file. So the class name, you can find it in my CSS file. So if I go here in my app.css, you can see all these different classes. So I'm trying to build this one right now. So here we've created the div, and within the div we have to create the two income and expense divs. So we'll have one div for the income and one div for the expense. And so now in the div for the income, I need to show my title income, and similarly I'll have my title for expense. So here you should be able to see, well, actually I haven't added this to my app.js, so I can here import summary from account summary. Okay. And then show my account summary component. So now I have my big container for all of my income expenses, and then I have my two income and expense divs here. And now I can show my, go back here, I have to show the values even. So for my positive income, I'll show right now just a placeholder. And the same thing here with my expense. So this should show up here. And then one thing in the CSS, we have a class for this. So class name for the positive for the income. For this value, it's money plus. So this CSS will be applied here, and then on this, have class name of money minus. So this will be applied. So now we have our container and our income and expense summaries with just some placeholder amounts here. We'll update these when we move forward. Now the next component we have is our transaction history. So okay, this we can exit. So let's add our transaction history, import transaction history. Component slash transaction history. Then here we'll have our transaction history. Right now it should give a error because we haven't actually exported it here. So let's make our transaction history component. So we can again use the React functional component extension. And here we want to do we want to write the code for our transaction history. So let's give it heading. Here now we should have a transaction history heading. And now we also want to put some placeholder data. So we'll give an unordered list with the class. All these classes go back to our CSS file. So an unordered list to contain all the transactions in our history. And then within it, we need to have some list item. And the list item would be, also have a class for this. So if it's a positive transaction, it's a plus value. And if it's a negative transaction, it's a minus class name. So I'll just create both examples here, plus and minus. And then here in the value, I'll just give it a description, project one income. So that's my description. So if I would look here, whenever I give a new transaction, I have to give a description and an amount. So here I'm giving a description, and I also need to give an count, the amount of the transaction. So here I'll just put 1,000. This. So here I have my, you can see project one income. And the way the CSS is working is, if it's a positive value, it shows the green border here and it hovers, it will also do green. So it gets this from the class name. And we're also doing the similar thing for the minus. And here we can have another. So we can do maybe project one salaries we may be paid. And let's just put a span amount here. Let's say we paid, maybe we paid $500 of salaries. So now we have a positive value here showing the positive transactions and the negative value showing the negative transaction. So kind of we just made some dummy data here to basically get the UI working. Okay, so that's our transactions. One more thing we want to add is a button that we can use to remove these. So as you see here, if I have a transaction, I can remove the transaction. So what we want is a button to do that. So we create a button, and the button, what it will do is, let's just put some text there. So shows up, and then we want to give it a class name. And this class name for the button is delete button. And we want to do this for both the transactions. So that way we'll have a button. But right now it doesn't work because we haven't actually made it do anything. But at least we have the UI now. So that's our transaction history component. The UI has been created. And then the last one is our add new transaction component. So let's also create the add transaction. Okay. So for the add transaction component, what we want to do is have a form which collects the description and the transaction amount. And that's what we will use to show on the transaction history, right? So here, let's again create a React component, and here this will be our add new transaction section, and then we can also render this. Let's just copy. So this is add transaction. And then we want to in that component. So here we go, add new transaction. So our component is being rendered. Now we can go ahead and code the rest of the things here. So here what we want is we want the form. So our basic form element, and then within the form we have two different inputs. So we have a description input and a transaction amount input. So in our form, what we'll do is we'll create two divs for each form input. So in the first div, and this has a class of form control for both my divs. So it knows that this is a form control div. Now within it, now I can create my label and my input. So first one I have is first input is my description. So here for my description, I'll do description. Then just how we have class names in React, we don't use class because it goes in the React library when it when it builds the HTML, it converts this into the class. So that's why we're using class name. Just like this, when we create a label, we don't use the for attribute. We use the HTML for attribute. So this, and then you can give it which input we're trying to create this label for. So that's our label. Let's see here. So I have my label. And now I also have to create my input. So I have to create an input, which what it's just going to do is get my, it's just going to be a type equals text because it's a text input. I just want a box where the user can come in and type the description. So I'm using a text description here. I can give it an ID so I can link it with my label. So description ID. And then I also want to maybe placeholder. So I can give it like a default value when the user loads it. So I can say detail of transaction. So format it nicely. So that's my input for my description. So here I can see I have my label and I have my detail of transaction input field. The other form control we had to create is the transaction. So for the transaction, again, we'll need a label. Let's create a label, and then in the label, I'll have the transaction amount. And then this label is for my transaction amount. So now when I come and create my input, I have to type number, getting a number value, then my ID, say this transaction amount, and then for a placeholder, maybe I'll say per transaction lowercase. So that's my input, and I close my input this, and so that's my transaction amount input. And all I need now is the button. So I need the add transaction button. So here, after this div, I'll create another form control button. And this button will have the value add transaction displayed. There it is. Now we just want to apply the CSS. So I'll give it a class name, and it's called button in my CSS file. So this should, here we go. So now we have a complete UI of our all of our components ready. That's the first part of our assignment. Now I'll just exit from here. Now what we want to do is we want to create state and use the state when we add transactions. So what we'll do is we'll use the state in our add transaction file. So let's add transaction. So what we want to do now is all of our transactions that we're adding, we want it to be actually held somewhere. And right now, because we don't have we're not connecting this application to a database, we're actually just going to be storing whatever values we have in our transaction history into something called state, which holds all the data that can be accessible by the application. So to do this, we want to import the use state from React as well. And then now that we have the use state, we can create state. So in our add transaction component, we can now use this and create some state for our description and our transaction amount. So what we'll do is we'll create a const for, let's create two consts, one for the description and one for the transaction amount. So for the description, I'll have description. That's the value I want to use. So it's like my when we create this, we're using destructuring here to get the output from the use state here. Right. So the use state returns two things. It gives us the value, and it gives us the function we use to update the value. And then we want to do the same thing for the transaction amount. And then we want a function that we'll use to update the transaction amount. So set transaction amount.
Set description function as a missing T.
What's that?
Set description function as a missing T. It's in a
Yes.
set.
Thank you. So use and then use state. Now we have created these two state objects. So we can use this now to store the data that we're having here. So now what we want to do is we want to link the state to the actual form. So what we want to do is whenever we enter a value here and add the transaction, we want to add those into our state. So we want to add the transaction to our state. And we do this by when we have this form, we want to link this form to our state. So what we'll do is in our input, we'll have something called, we'll have an attribute called value, and the value will be the description. That's for my description, and the similar thing here for my transaction amount, which is here. So now I've linked my form input to my state. And what I want to do is I want to update the state whenever whenever there's a change in my form input. So for this, in our input, we want to have something that is triggered every time we have some new change in our field. So whenever we enter something here, it should update the state when we submit the form. So for this, what we'll do is on change, use the on change, and here we'll have a basic function. And what we'll do is we wanna whenever there's an event, we're just calling it E for now. And whenever there's a change, what I want to do is I want to call my set description function so I can update the state. So set description, and in the set description, I want to use the value from my from this input field. So for that, in my set description, I pass in the value from my event, the value of this target. So this way, I'll get whatever the user types into this field will be used to call the set description function that will update the state. And I want to do the same thing on my amount, but instead of set description, it will be set transaction amount, because that's the function we use here. Okay. So that should update my state every time whenever I type in text into these input fields. One thing we can do is so this is Opera doesn't have that extension, but if I open Chrome has this nice React extension. So here I can, if I go and inspect this thing, here I have my React components. So I can see all my different components. And if I go to my add transaction, it shows me I have state, and it's undefined right now. If I add something, so it adds the value of whatever I have in my input field to my state hook. Right. So we haven't actually updated the state yet, but it's storing these values so we can update the state, because we haven't actually called the function. Okay, so that's done. Now, what I want to do is we want to create some context. So I can exit from here. So now what we want to do is, in our application, we have these transactions. Right now, it's only accessible in this state here. So right now, because I added the transaction details are only available in my add transaction component, but I want to have all of these information so I can calculate all of my figures. So what we need to do this is a context. So instead of having to manually pass in all these values through properties, we can create a global context and link that with our state. So to do this, what we do is in my source folder, I'll create another folder for context. So in my context now, I'll add a file. And we can call it whatever, but let's call it global state. Calling it global state because we're just using one context for this application because there isn't really multiple functionalities. It's all related to the transaction. If we had other functions, maybe we would have, this would be like the transaction state, and then we can have other components, other contexts for those different functionalities if we didn't need the transaction data. Right, so now that I have my global state JavaScript file, I want to create the context here. So when we create the context, what I want is to import React. I also want to import the create context. And we're also going to be using the reducer. So I'm also going to be importing the use reducer from React. So that's our, we're going to need these from the React library so we can create the context. And now what we can do is we're using, what we're doing is whenever we submit this transaction, we're saving it to some state. So we need to initialize our state. We need an initial state, right? So let's create the initial state. And here what we want is to create a const for the initial state. And here, because transactions are a list of transactions, so I'll create an object, and that object will have my, so this is my state object. And in the state object, I'll create transactions, and transactions are going to be a list. And it's going to be a list of objects. So each transaction has three things. We have already seen the description and the amount, but we also need to be able to uniquely identify each transaction. So we need an ID as well. So first we give an ID. So let's just add some sample initial state. So we have an ID. We need the description. And for this, I'll just put one, just some dummy text. And we need a transaction amount. So transaction amount, we need just some dollar value, say 1,000 maybe. So that's one transaction. And since it's a list, it's an array, I can have multiple transactions. So all of them would have a unique ID. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll just make one income, expense, and then income 2, and then I'll make an expense 2. And then, so my expense, I'll have like a $100 expense, a $2,000 income, and maybe a $500 expense. So here, now we have some, a basic transaction object with some starter transactions just to have something to work with when we begin. Otherwise, it will just be empty. So that's our initial state. Now what we want is to create the global context. So what we really want is our entire application to have access to this data. And we do this using the context API. So let me create the global context. And in my global context, I'll just export my global context. And this is going to contain something. I'm going to create my context here. And the value of my create context is going to be my initial state. So that's, now the context is created. The next step is we need to just creating the context isn't enough. We need to give access to the transactions to all of my components. So in my state context here, I need to create a provider that goes along with this context. So create a provider for global context. And here, we also want to export the provider so the components can use it. And we'll give this a name. We can just call it global provider. And this is going to be our provider that passes up all of our state, which contains our transactions, to our components. So what we want to do is arrow function. So this is our provider, and in the provider now what we want to do is give access to our transactions. So we do this. So first, in our provider, we have to also return what is the provider going to give to my component. So here we'll give this a global provider, sorry, global context provider. Okay. So we're linking this provider to our global context, and we have to give a value. What value are we giving to all the components that access this provider? So in our value, what I want is I want to give access to my transactions. So give access to my transactions, and this is just a variable here. The actual transactions are in my state, so state.transactions. So the provider will now have a value of transactions, which will contain my initial state. So that's that, and then let's see. We want to close our global context provider, and we want to pass these transactions to all of our components. What we're going to do is we have to wrap all of our components around our provider. So these are all going to be children elements of our provider. So here we can say giving this to our children, and we call it, we'll have our children components here. So right now, one thing. So working. Right. What we also want to do is we want to create a reducer. So the point of the reducer is every time we submit a new transaction, we want to change our state. And the way we change our state is that we create a new state, and we do this using a reducer. So here we'll call our we'll create a const, and basically what we're doing is using the reducer. So what the reducer does is it calls a reducer. So what the reducer does is it calls a reducer function that we create. So we can create any function. So let's just call it add reducer, and then we also have to give it the state. So we have the initial state that we created. So this will be our use reducer. What we'll get out of it is we have our state and a dispatch message that we send based on how we want to create a new state. Right. So now we have our context and provider setup. Let's also create this app reducer. So here, we'll create the app reducer.js. In the app reducer.js now, we want to do is we want to create a basic reducer that will return a new state whenever an action is performed. So we can export default, and we're getting two things here. So we're getting the state and the dispatch. So we're going to use these. So we have the state, and the dispatch contains an action of what action we want to perform. So in this function, right now, what we can do is we haven't actually submitted the transaction yet, so we'll just create a basic switch statement to deal with all the different transactions we get, the different types of actions. So we have the action.type. Okay. And based on the action.type, we'll have some different conditions we can deal with each type differently. So right now we don't have any types. We'll just create a default type, which will return the state as it is with no changes. So basically we're saying no action was performed, so it makes sense that we're just returning the state as it is. We're not creating a new state in this case. Okay. The other thing we have to do is we've called the app reducer here, but we haven't imported it. So we need to import the reducer. In our import, so we'll import our app reducer from app reducer. So now we have our context set up with the provider, and it's referencing a reducer. Okay. So what we can do now is, let's see. What we want to do is in our app.js, we want to call the provider. So we want to wrap all of these components with our provider so they can have access to our initial state through that context. So we can just do global provider. So now we've wrapped our components with the global provider. Let's check in our application. Oops. Global provider is not defined. Because, why is it not defined? Because we haven't imported the provider in our app.js. So let's do that, import the global provider. So we can import global provider from, and the provider is in the context folder in the global state file. Now, let's just check it on Chrome. So here we have access, so we can see our app, and then in our app we have the provider. So in the provider you can see we have the hooks, and this reducer gives us access to our transactions. So now all the components that are contained in this global provider have access to my context, and the context contains my transactions that are in the state. Okay. What are we doing next? Show transactions from the state. Okay. So here, right now, what we did was in our code. Maybe I should commit this. Created UI and UI context user. So here I can say I created the components for header balance, account summary, transaction history, and add transaction. Also created the context, the global context, and its provider. And I also wrapped all components with the provider, so components have access to state. Then I can commit this, and I can push this. My GitHub action will run in a minute. We can check and see if our code is updated here. But in the meantime, let's continue. Now what we want to do is, we have created this initial state and we have some transactions here, but we're not showing them. So what we want to do is, in our transaction history, we want to show the transactions from our state, not these transactions that we hard-coded. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to update the we want to update the transaction history component. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to use this state. I want to use the context in this transaction history. So when I import, I also have to import the use context. We also need to import the global context that we've created. So let's say import the global context. So to do that, we want to do import global context from. This is coming from in our hierarchy. Our context is in the source folder and our components are in the components folder. So I have to go back to my source folder, then to my context, and then I have to get my global state. Okay. So now I've imported use context from React and I've imported my global context. So now I should have access to my data. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to get, instead of calling like global context.transactions or something, we want to have a locally created variable. So we can do restructuring here and say we want just the transactions from our context, from our global context. So now we have our, we're getting all of our transactions. Maybe if we want to log it, check. So transaction history in my console. So here I'm getting the log of all my transactions from the state. Okay. All right. So now that I'm getting all the transactions in the state, what I want to do is get rid of this. I want to create another component for each transaction. So what I want to do is create another JS file for transaction. And we want to, because we want to have a component for each of those transactions. So now we can do the React functional component, and here in our, what we want to return is actually the list item. Okay, so we actually just want to return the list item. So let's just grab this list item and put it here. So that's my list item. And what I want to do is I want to use this transaction component in my history, my transaction history. So I can, what I want to do is here I can import my transaction. So I'll be import transaction transaction from transaction. So now I have access to my transaction component in my transaction history. And then what I can do is, instead of calling this list item here, I have the list item in my transaction component. So here, all I want to do is call my transaction component. So here we have the one transaction coming in. Now, what we want to do is in our transaction component, we want to get the values from the state. Yeah, okay, so here in our transaction history, we have access to our context. So what we can do here is, instead of having these hard-coded values, I can say I want the description of the transaction here, and then in my span, I want the transaction amount. Okay. And then I'm doing this because I have access to my transaction from transaction history. So I have to pass this value in, right? So when I call the transaction component, I have to send the transaction. So to send the transaction, I'm saying transaction, I'm sending the transaction, and the transaction that I want to send is my transaction from my context. Okay. Now, let's see what happens. Transaction is not defined. It's missing. Right, okay. I'm gonna do this. Sorry. I didn't meant to do that. I was meant to. When I show the transaction, I want to show it for my transactions from my context. So let's see, I'm calling my transactions here, right? So what I want to do is iterate over all these transactions. So I want to do a transaction dot map. So I want to iterate over every transaction in my array, and for each transaction, what I want to do is, which one this pops up? Okay. So for each transaction, I want to show the I want to show the transaction. So here you can see now I'm getting all of my transactions from my state. So let's see. So in my transaction history, I have access to my transactions. And so each of my descriptions are coming through, and then the amounts are also coming through. One thing we also have to do is to provide a key on which transaction we want to send. And the key is based on the transaction. We have to uniquely identify the transaction. We do this with the transaction ID. So when we match this, we're matching this based on the transaction ID. So here you can see transaction key 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the keys are the IDs. Okay. So now we have, I wonder if this worked. What happened? Something happened in my deployment. Go to GitHub. So it failed. So it's saying dispatch is assigned a value but never used.
Basically, it's running a lint, so it gives a warning. So any unused element should be removed. So it was your previous commit, I guess. A new commit, it will work.
I think I still haven't used my dispatch though. So
okay, so if you're pushing it, then you can remove it.
So I go to my my app reducer. It's calling this one, right?
Yes.
So now, what have we updated? Now we have in our summary, we can say getting transaction history from state, and then we updated the transaction history and created a transaction component to get transactions from the state using the context, right? Also disabled the reducer. Push this.
There was one error or two error for unused variable?
There was logo is defined but never used.
Okay, so you have to remove it as well.
Okay. Logo, I think I'm getting in my
Make it right, you need to remove it.
app.js, right? This one, right?
Yes. Yes.
Let's say removed logo. React logo. So So this one. So just running this one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, still something. State is not defined. What?
You just remove the reducer you were using state, I guess. Oh,
Oh,
yes.
I guess I really need this.
Just remove the dispatch. Just remove the dispatch. So right now, as we are not using any function, we are not calling dispatch. So that's why
Yeah.
it's giving the unused variable error. So
Yeah.
meanwhile, the code is being deployed. Let me explain one thing, that whatever we are looking at, we are trying to create an application. And when we are trying to create an application, we have a lot of component in a single application. So we have an option. We can do all the coding in a single file, one or two file, all the, instead of creating, as we have created multiple component, balance, account summary, transaction, they were really small component. Some has one as a header component, it has a one div. It does not matter, as we are learning learning the how to create separate component and create an application built based on multiple component. That's why we are creating these small components. So whenever you are working in a project, you need to understand that you have a lot of elements in your page, and based on your requirement, based on your usability, you have to decide how granular you want to go. You want to create a separate balance component, you want to create separate transaction component, you want to create separate history component or not. It depends on the usability of your application, and then you can decide and then you can use. So at this moment, as we are learning the basic level, so we can do whatever we want and however we want. So we can create a smaller components for it, even if it's in a single div. And later on, we can when we will be working on real big applications, then we can see that when we are creating a component, we will be having a big UI element into it. At this moment there were not, but it's still important to understand that we have multiple components. And the latter part, which Adil explained, the context API, which is important, that to provide pull down the properties, we need to context API and use reducer so that it will become a global state and can be used all over. Yes, Adil, please.
Okay. So now we have the now it's updated. So it's been deployed, and we can see the transaction history coming through our state. Uh, how are we on time? Should we continue or should we continue next time? I think we've gone
I
over
guess
time.
it's 11:26. We are I guess we are out of time. We can add the functionality functions next time.
Yeah. So it's good that it's been committed now and it's running, so they can see the code. Um, so yeah, we can continue from here next time.
Just show the structure and the component one more time so they can.
This stuff, the file structure.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So here in our project, we have the source folder, and in here we have, let me close these first. So we have the, you see the app.js file. So here we're importing all of our components from the components folder. So each component has its own JavaScript file. So we're importing all of them separately, and then we're calling them into our app function here. Then what we have is our context is created in our global state. So here we have our context. So here we created the initial state where we have the initial transactions, which you can see in our application here. So these are all coming from that initial state right now. And so we created the global context with this initial state. So when we created the provider and gave access to this state using our initial state, all of the components that we have wrapped around this with this global provider now have access to everything in our initial state. So that includes the transactions list. So then all of our application components can get access to all the transactions. We created the reducer, but we haven't really used it right now, so we don't have to worry about it. I think that's enough for now, right?
Yes. So as project deadline is 22nd, right? 22nd June.
Is it? So let's see.
Yes. So
What day is that? That's Monday.
That's Monday. Okay. Anyhow, you have the material also, you guys, and we have completed the I guess around 80 to 90% of the project here, and just the only thing missing is the delete transaction and add transaction functionality, which is two functions remain, so which we will cover in our next class. But you guys have all the resources, so you can create the application, and don't wait for the what we do in class, so that you can submit projects as early as possible.
Yeah. So hopefully on Saturday in our session we'll complete the application as well. So if you get stuck anywhere, probably the Saturday session will help you.
Yes.
So I think that's good for today. So we'll
Quite
see you
handy.
guys on.
Quite handy coding session today.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, everyone. See you guys on Saturday. Bye.
Okay. Bye, guys.